I wanted to share with you today a way to construct character stats for role-playing games in a simple and approachable way. Because I've talked to a lot of people at events like this and beer night and stuff where they're like, I'm trying to make my Facebook game or my iPhone game or whatever, and we need character progression in there and numbers there, and we have no idea what these numbers actually do or where they came from. And I can sympathize with that. I remember when I started doing the same kind of thing, I had no idea where those numbers came from either. But I eventually figured it out. One of the keys to it that I found was that our role-playing games depend a lot on predictability. We're trying to sell an experience where things work the way players expect they should work. It's the RPG promise. It's a world where you get what you deserve. If you talk to a quest giver and he says, hey, go do this thing and I'll give you this stuff in exchange, and you go do that thing, you will actually get what he promised you, which is not how the real world works. What you see is what you get. It's a world with rules you can trust, and it's stable, safe, predictable, and fair. We want to make a mathematical foundation for a world that is stable, safe, predictable, and fair too. So, for example, let's consider our warrior, who's going to be our player character tonight. And we have a monster too. I really like this guy. I found him on a clip art site. He has a great head of hair. I don't know what he's supposed to be, though. We'll call him a Minotaur with the club. Both our player character and our Minotaur guy are going to have two core stats, damage and health. Eventually, as we build more flesh onto this game, it will have more stats, but they all fundamentally come back to damage and health. Most role-playing games come back to damage and health. The framework we're going to build has three core variables which factor into those stats. It's time to kill, starting player damage, and power increase per level. Time to kill is the amount of time it takes a player to kill an NPC of the same level. It's really important, the pacing of the game. If you're making a Diablo clone, it might be a couple seconds. If you're making a PvP MMO, it needs to be a lot longer than that. On DC, the DC Online that I just shipped earlier this year, it was actually 30 seconds in our spreadsheet for a long time, which sounds like an eternity, but in a PvP game, you need to give people time to think about what they're doing, you know? It will be one of your most iterated on values, so that's why I advise keeping it as a constant set aside in your spreadsheet, and it's really important to keep it consistent. I see a lot of people thinking that it needs to change over time. It really doesn't. Starting player damage is the damage per second dealt by a level 1 player. It has a big impact on player perception. If you're making a D&D style game, you want it to be pretty low. If you're making a ridiculous over-the-top action game, it might be pretty high because it's funny that way if you start out doing like 600 damage. In general, I still would advise keeping it small so you have room to go up. Power increase per level is how much better players get as they level, and it also varies depending on the kind of game you're making. But in general, values tend to be smaller than you think. For MMO games like I make, it tends to be 2 to 5%. Last time I checked, World of Warcraft was like 2.25%, but that was a couple years ago, and they've redone everything since then. You have two choices. You can be exponential or flat. Your exponential curve keeps things really consistent, so it's good in that respect. On the downside, things get really ridiculous at the high end. That's happened to lots of games. A flat curve is less consistent, but numbers stay reasonable. And I really strongly advise keeping it consistent. I see a lot of designers thinking, well, you'll get a better feeling of progression if your character really gets better as you level. Like, well, I would still advise against it. It screws up players' perception of how they're progressing, and it makes itemization a real pain in the ass. So you'll have to take my word for it. For building our spreadsheet, I like to pull my variables aside into a nice little box here, and I give them a nice background color and give them a border so you can tell that's a number you should change. We're going to plug in our starting values for our sample game here. Time to kill of 15 seconds, starting DPS of 25, and we'll plug in 2.5% for power increase. We'll go with an exponential curve for the hell of it. We'll start filling out a table by the side with those core values in it. Our level 1 DPS is starting player DPS. That's pretty obvious. Our level 1 health is starting player DPS times time to kill. And if you think about it, that makes sense. That is the amount of damage per second you must take for that many seconds to die. And level 2 and subsequent DPS is where our power increase factors in. It's the DPS of the level before times 1 plus power increase per level, because this is an exponential curve again. Level 2 and subsequent health values are current DPS times time to kill. And we can click and drag that down in our business productivity software here and generate a whole table for the core values for our entire game. If we want to go back to our warrior and start building out the stats that she's going to have, the biggest thing we need to build is some abilities. So she has something to do in combat. And all of her attacks are still going to be based on 2 core values. Attack rate in seconds, which is how often she attacks. You can split that up into recharge timers and cast timers and get fancy with it, but it is still basically you can use this thing every this many seconds. And variance is how the damage varies over time, so you're not hitting for, varies per hit, so you're not hitting for 25 every time, which isn't necessarily bad, but looks really bad. So we'll plug those values into our spreadsheet. They're also pulled out to the side in a nice little variable box. We'll make a couple new columns for it. Our minimum damage for this basic melee attack we're building for her sword is, well, you can read it up there. It's a big formula. It's really simple, though. It is current DPS times attack rate times 1 minus variance. Our maximum damage is the same thing, except we're adding the variance. And we can click and drag that down, and now we have damage values built for that ability for every level it could possibly be cast at. But if since this is her attack, her basic attack, we could assume that this is it's her sword, so it's how much damage is on the sword itself. And if we were to say she gets a new sword every 5 levels, we can see that our power increase our low power increase has done us a disservice in that her newbie weapon is 10 to 15 damage, but her upgrade at level 5 there in blue is only 11 to 17, which kind of sucks. We can fix that by jacking the power increase up to 10%. And it's nice here we update the 1 number, the big red number up in the upper left, and it updates the entire system to match. That's one of the things I really like about this framework. And it has increased our level 5 sword up to 15 to 22, which is an awesome upgrade over 10 to 15. But on the other hand, our numbers look really stupid at the high end. So at level 25, her sword's doing 98 to 148, which is just stupid. That's one of the things we signed up for with an exponential curve. But we can continue adding more abilities using the same formula and plugging in different numbers, and it works about the same. Like I added an ability here called Shield Smash that has a 15-second rate of attack, so it does a ton of damage. And in this case, like I would probably do that as an instant cast with a 15-second recast timer. We can get back to our Minotaur dude here and work out his stats now. The one thing we have to, okay, so going back to this guy, I would advise keeping monster stats as similar to player stats as possible, because it makes your life much easier down the road, especially if you're making a PvP game. Oh, I only have 2 minutes left. On the other hand, we need to vary his stats so that we're trying to make a role-playing game, and the way this game is set up now, everybody's doing the same damage over time, and if they attack each other at the same time, they have about an equal chance of winning, since everybody hits every time. And in a role-playing game, you don't want the monsters to win 50% of the time. They won't play your game very long. So we're going to nerf his damage by adding a 4th main variable called margin of victory. That is the percent of health that a player will have left over after they fight this dude, and we'll set it at 75%. I would really advise keeping it easy, at least during testing, so that your fellow developers want to play your game. Because I've seen the case where they don't, and it's not good. So we'll basically multiply our core DPS curve by that factor, and things will work out. We'll make a big table out of it. We'll make some abilities that are exactly the same as the player abilities, only using that column. Now we have our basic framework. Things we're missing are damage mitigation and avoidance are 2 big ones, so you don't hit for whatever the random factor or whatever that random roll between min and max is. We won't hit for that every single time. We'll take less than that or miss sometimes, maybe, make it a little more interesting. We'll have more interesting stats too. So maybe you have an ability or a stat that impacts your spell damage and one that impacts your melee damage. Players tend to like that kind of thing. But what we do have is an awesome spreadsheet and a great start. Thank you. If you thought this was interesting, I'm doing an hour-long version at GDC this year. You should come back.